Are you or have you been a part of a religious tradition that is about either rules or image, or maybe both? And my question would be, from my perception, whenever I have failed because I've brought rules and image together, what that's done for me is it's made me only follow the rules because of the image I was portraying. Do you relate to that at all? When rules and image are God, if you don't follow the rules and you don't have the image, where is God? Are there some rules and image that maybe you need to let go of today? Take some time and write it down. Write down rules that you live by. Write down things that are important to your image and see how many of them are impacting your life for the better. And then see if any you think might need to change to live a better, more fulfilled life.
Welcome to the Derelict Podcast. For the disparaged, depleted, and delinquent souls trying to find our way, we're talking about the scary part of the journey, where we don't know how it'll end. Let's be free to face our fucking failures in real time as the most unadulterated, truest version of who we are. No sugarcoating. Welcome to the shit show, you derelict.
Welcome back to the Derelict Podcast and the things that you're not supposed to talk about. I'm your host, Josh Abandonato, and we are here to talk about religion. It's going to be very fun. So I've been thinking about how I've wanted to do this, and frankly, there's a reason why it hasn't really come up a whole lot in the first 13, now 14 episodes of this podcast. However, there was one on kids and God. Go listen to that one. We had our very, very special guest, Veronica, on for that one, and co-host Tyler, and it was a really good one. I think we might revisit it at some point. But for now, I realized when thinking about this podcast today that I've been avoiding it. Why have I been avoiding it? Well, the Derelict Podcast is for those that are disparaged, thrown away from society. They're a bit wrecked. They might not fit in. And I grew up in a very religious household and don't really feel like I fit into that structure anymore. And I was a little nervous to talk about it. So here we are. Today, I didn't write a whole lot of notes. I wrote a few, but I'm mainly just going to speak from my heart. Let's just talk about failure in a religious context. So today we're talking about my journey with religion. This episode is all about how I failed at religion as a kid. Then we're going to do how I failed at religion as a young adult, and probably how I failed at religion post-divorce. We'll see how far we get today. I'm assuming today will just be the kid one. So, as usual, how do we talk about this? Well, I would say in a traditional podcast format, there is a host, maybe a guest host, maybe a guest, or maybe just a host that has figured it out and made some strides and had some success and knows what they believe, knows what they feel, knows how they got there, etc. This is not that podcast. If you've tuned in thinking, oh my God, I am now going to know everything about religion, and from a very wise old sage that has figured it all out with their long life of mistakes and failures and figure them out, wrong podcast. This is not a podcast about success. I've had plenty of success. Co-hosts have had plenty of success. Guests have had plenty of success. It's not that we're a bunch of losers. It's that what we're doing, what we've done, in fact, has created a space for ourselves, for you. Thank you for being here on this journey with us, for us to deal with this stuff real time. So even though today I'm talking about religion and how I failed as a kid, the end is not going to be, okay, here's now what success looks like. It's more of how is that interfering or impacting my life right now? So a lot of the things that I learned or struggled with as a kid is stuff that is still impacting my life, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And now as a dad with kids, I'm trying to figure out how to pass on the good things to them and remove maybe the not so good things, and go from there. Bottom line, I still feel like I'm failing at this. We're in the midst of it. We're in the midst of failure together. Somebody's got to be vulnerable. Somebody's got to get naked first and jump in the pool. It'll be me today. Welcome. Enjoy the ride. So, again, as I mentioned, today we're talking about my journey with religion. This one is all about how I failed at religion as a kid. Now, that title might be a little misleading because, I don't know, do kids really fail at religion? It's more of how do I fail at interpreting my experience as a kid today? I think that's part of the question for me, at least. So sometimes I like to add disclaimers to the show, and it's not because I'm worried about somebody suing me or hearing me incorrectly. That will guaranteed happen, and that's fine. Bring it on. Except for the lawsuit part. Don't sue me. But here's my disclaimer. I hope you're not here thinking that I am going to talk about how religion is in of itself evil. I don't believe that. I'm not against religion. I'm not against organized religion. It has proven to be something that I'm not sure if it's for me. We'll talk about that later. But I'm not against it. I think it's had a really big impact in not only my life, but my family's life, my kids' lives, friends' lives, a lot of people's lives. I'm not against it. This is just my story, at least a part of my story. I don't believe in banishing religion, but honestly, I'm definitely on a journey trying to figure out what that means for me. And I have not figured it out. So here's the deal. As we often talk about on this show, we like to start with how we, have failed at whatever the topic is of the day. So the first question for me then is, how have I failed lately regarding religion, and specifically about, failing at religion as a child? So where my mind automatically goes as a dad is to my kids. I had a lot of structure as a kid, and I felt like it did wonders for me. I went to church all growing up. I went to Christian school all growing up. And frankly, lately, especially I would say the last few months, I've been floundering a bit, trying to figure out how to pass on maybe some positive elements of religion to my kids. We watch church from home is what they call it every 2 weeks. And it's just this really short church service produced by a really great church in Southern California, where somebody comes on, they talk for a little bit, they show a little cartoon, we have a conversation around it. And we talk about God pretty openly, honestly, etc. But what I often wonder is, am I failing by not giving them the religious structure, let's call it, that I had growing up? So we're not going to a traditional church right now. I don't have them involved in youth group, youth ministry, whatever you want to call it. We don't go to temple. We don't go anywhere on a Sunday. And my growing up experience was quite the opposite. We don't do devotions together. I did a lot of that in my household growing up, and frankly, I hated it. It always felt forced, like, oh, let's sit down and read something that doesn't apply to children at all. We read Our Daily Bread, for any of those Our Daily Bread survivors out there. Again, nothing against it. I think my dad still reads it. Good for him. Good for all the people that love it. Nothing wrong with it. I think as an adult, it makes a lot more sense. But as a child, it's boring and it's dry and there's no story to it, and it just doesn't keep your attention. So I remember sitting down to do Our Daily Bread and just hating it, just being like, no, do we have to do this? And I think as I think about my failures, part of what comes up for me with my kids right now is I just don't want them to have that experience. I don't want them to feel forced. So I think my biggest, I don't even know if it's a failure, but my biggest concern is I just don't want my kids to feel forced into something. I want them to be able to experience God or their higher power or universe or whatever it ends up being for them on their own, but I also want to be able to guide them. This is not a parenting episode, but I mentioned before in one of the parenting episodes that I used to have a friend that was more of the opinion of, well, let me just let my kid figure it out no matter what it is. I understand the logic and the benefit of that, but at the same time, as a parent, I feel like part of my job is to help guide and direct my children. I would say that that is probably pretty consistent with the major world religions as well, that it's our job as parents to kind of guide our kids. But I don't know how to do that and also let them figure out their own thing. That's what I'm really struggling with. So I've failed plenty of times with that recently, and I'm not really sure what to do about it. Right now, I'm kind of continuing on the same. I'm focusing more on having conversations with God versus a religious structure, and we can talk about that more on another podcast, but it really bothers me. That's why I'm bringing it up right now with you. I think I'm a failure in that. I often wonder, well, should I get involved with the church? Should I have my children go there, etc.? I talk to them about it. I ask their opinions. I see what they think, and that's what we end up doing. But I don't know. I don't know if it's the right thing to do. What do you guys think? I'm curious. If you're listening to this or watching this, do you have an opinion about this? What do you do with your kids? I'd love for you to shoot me a note in the resources. There's a link to my personal, well, not my personal, but the podcast email, which I will see, and I will still replying to 100% of the messages at this point. So I will respond to you, but I would love to hear your stories. What is your story of growing up in religion? And specifically as a young kid, because that's what we're going to focus on today. And if you're a parent, how is that translated now if you have young kids? Are you doing the same thing that was done to you growing up? Have you changed it? Have you altered it? Have you given up completely? I'm curious. I'd love to take a poll. If this was live, I'd take a poll from you right now. So shoot me a note. If you're watching this video and there's a comment section, leave a comment. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Absolutely. Because frankly, I'm still trying to figure it out. So if I'm going to talk about my kid relationship with religion, I feel like it's unfair to talk about that before I talk about where that came from. My parents, as an example. So what their experience was. Now, I'm not going to be on this podcast talking about my parents' experience because I'm not my parents. But I can tell you the little bit that I know about their experience growing up so that maybe it makes sense what happened with me growing up. So my parents did not grow up, they grew up, I would say, in semi-religious households. So one was from a Italian Catholic family, which basically meant they went to church a couple times a year, maybe for Easter, Christmas, but wasn't really a part of their everyday life, didn't really go to mass very often. Every once in a while would, but they're Italian, so of course they're Catholic, right? That's any Italians out there, give me a thumbs up because you know it's true. If you're Catholic, you're Italian, right? It's just part of the culture. The other side of my family was more of I don't know, I think that they had some they were like an American religious kind of household. Maybe they would go to church every once in a while, but it really didn't impact their daily life. It really didn't affect them at all. So when my parents, near the time when they met, they went through kind of a conversion experience where they felt like they became Christian, which was their religion, still is. And they were part of the Jesus movement. So if anybody knows anything about this, Chuck Smith is really well known for this, Calvary Chapel pastor back in the day, and Lonnie Frisbee, who was apparently playfully known as the hippie pastor. They actually made a movie a few years ago that I haven't seen. It's called The Jesus Revolution. Frankly, I should probably go watch it and then come back and share my thoughts on it on a future episode, and I might just do that. But my point with all of that is that this was a turning point for them. So they were in their 30s and 40s when they, met Jesus, and they became Jesus lovers. It made sense to them given their childhood. Both of them grew up in kind of rough childhoods for different reasons. Maybe that's another podcast episode. But for now, I don't know, it gave them, I think, hope. Again, I don't want to speak for them, but it gave them hope. It gave them a sense of meaning. It gave them rules, regulations, things that they could follow. And I think that made a lot of sense for them. Oscar Wilde has a quote that says, "Every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. I love that quote. But what I would say is that, at least a part of this movement, from my experience, it was almost the opposite of that quote. So instead of every saint has a past, every sinner has a future, it was kind of the opposite. It was like, well, you're basically a sinner, and then you meet God, and then you're a saint. And that doesn't mean that that entire movement says that you don't ever have problems anymore. But have you ever listened to somebody that comes from that ideology? At least for me, this is what I've experienced. I've experienced people say, well, that was before I knew Jesus. Since I've met him, everything's totally different. And, I don't know, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I just always think it's interesting how black and white it is. At least it seems like it was from that movement. It seems like that movement started off really amazingly because it's bringing in all these hippies and unwanted people, let's say, in the church. And a lot of people had problems with it. It seemed very all-inclusive and like a movement and everything else. And then, I don't know, at a certain point, it more became about whatever structure we have. And again, I think that makes sense based on what happened to me in my elementary years. So I grew up in that Christian home. They both became, Christians before that. And it was, a basic gospel believing or Bible believing type of church that I went to first. I read the Bible many times as a kid, over and over and over and over again. My parents like to tell the story that, I used to like hold my Bible underneath my sheets with a flashlight and read it after I was supposed to go to bed. I don't really remember that a whole lot, but that's what they keep telling me. So I'm assuming it's true. And I was a good kid. I didn't really have a lot of issues, a lot of troubles, get into a lot of stuff as a little kid. So I think because of that, it probably helped that whole box of religion. I remember, so one of the things I want to do today is I kind of want to walk through different experiences I've had to see what you've had, because maybe you can relate to this. So one of the things that I experienced in elementary school was Billy Graham. Remember him? Unless you're 20 years old listening to this, I would assume almost everybody remembers who Billy Graham was. Louis Plow was a lesser known evangelist, but both of them I grew up with. And with that movement, and I think probably similar to the Jesus movement, but with Billy Graham, evangelism, I don't know why I said that so weird, evangelism was key. We got to go tell people about Jesus. That was the key part, evangelism. And I've noticed with different movements, different structures, different churches, different things have been key. But from my perspective, evangelism was key. I remember going to one of his revivals, I don't remember what they were called, but filled a stadium with people, tens of thousands of people in a stadium. Billy Graham talking, does an altar call, everybody goes up, everybody's all excited, accepting Jesus, all that sort of stuff. I remember my friend got saved there when I was pretty young. I was probably around 10 or so when that happened. And frankly, the experience was one of a kind. It felt like what Calvary Chapel with Chuck Smith and all of them must have felt, honestly, for my parents back in like the 60s and 70s, where there's just this huge revival happening. And frankly, it's like a concert or any other big venue that you go to. It's exciting. I mean, a bunch of people kind of going down the same path, really excited about whatever is happening. What's not exciting about that, right? I don't know. I think that there's something, even if you don't agree with necessarily what's going on, that's really exciting about it. I understand how evangelism could be seen as exciting, because we're basically taking a message to different people that haven't heard the message before to try to get them all pumped up about the message. Well, if that's what evangelism is, that's what this podcast is all about, right? It's trying to encourage all of us to deal with our failures and vulnerabilities more real time. And okay, so I'm open to that, I guess. So in that movement, evangelism was key. So again, if you want to write me a note, here's what I'd love to hear from you about this one. How many of you grew up in an environment where the main purpose was evangelism, aka telling other people about the God that you believed in? So again, just because my experience is with Christianity does not mean that evangelism's only with Christianity. Fuck no. It's with all the world religions. It's beyond all the world religions. There are books in the business world about customer evangelists and everything else. Evangelism is much more than just one religion. But I'm just curious how you grew up, you that are listening or watching right now. Did you grow up in an evangelistic culture, aka our religion is the right one, therefore you need to convert to our religion? I think, at least from my experience growing up, the people that did this really well, one group was the Mormons, now called the Church of Latter-day Saints, I believe still. I had a lot of Mormon friends and neighbors growing up, and they were hardcore evangelists about their religion. They're like, look, this is the correct religion. Here's the reason why. You got to convert. You got to come to church, etc. I would say even more so from my experience than Christians, at least at least where I grew up in. So if you grew up in that environment, how did that affect you? I think for me, it affected me a lot because I started having this thought that there is only black and white when it comes to truth. This is the truth that I understand. This is the truth that I've been taught. Therefore, this is the correct truth. I think that's really caused me a lot of problems in my life, frankly. It's made me much less understanding, I would say, than maybe somebody that didn't grow up that way. At least that's what I found in my life. My brain is still triggered that way at times. It's still triggered with, well, is this right or wrong? Here's the black, here's the white. Here's the truth, here's the untruth. And frankly, I think there's a lot of gray. What about you? Are you listening to this podcast with a very clear sense of right and wrong, black and white? A very clear sense of which religion is correct in your terms? I'm curious. The other experience that I had as an elementary school, maybe some of you relate to this. I went to, up until I think about 5th grade, so most of elementary school, I went to an Assembly of God church. And if you know anything about that, that's a denomination of Christianity. If you know anything about that denomination, it's from my experience at least, it's really about experience. Experience is key. So with Billy Graham, evangelism is key. With Assemblies of God, it seems like experience is key. Are we experiencing the moving of the Spirit together? Less about knowledge, sending it elsewhere, etc., more about what is the experience that we're having right now. Now, still very much a Christian Bible-believing church. Frankly, I won in these little Bible competitions that they had. They were kind of like Jeopardy, so to speak, and you did Bible trivia, and we all competed against each other as kids, and I won them all the time. I could get the questions answered like that before the questions were even asked. And that brings me to one of the pieces about where maybe I failed as a kid and maybe the church failed me. I'm not sure, but I remember the pastor's wife became really jealous of me because of the fact that I could answer the question so well. And she felt like it was unfair because her daughter didn't have a chance. Now, I don't know. Did her daughter have a chance? Sure. Go learn more about the Bible. Stop being a little bitch and complaining about it. Just beat me fair and square. But there was a massive amount of jealousy that happened from that. That, along with a few other things, eventually led us to leaving and finding a new church. It just got to a point where it seems like we couldn't get past it. I don't really know why. Again, I was pretty young at this point, probably 4th, 5th grade. So I don't know a lot about what went down. But I do know that is not a news story. Do you have a story where you went to a church or temple or synagogue or something else growing up and somebody's strong opinion influenced somebody else's strong opinion and then you left? Was that a part of your experience? It has been for mine several times, and you hear about that later. Church still exists. Ironically enough, my parents still go to it every once in a while. from time to time. They just started doing that again a few years ago. So ironic how that came around, since, I haven't been to that church in about 30 years or so. So, wow, good for them. So along the same time, I was also in a Christian school. I think there was a lot of great things about it. There was great education, but unfortunately low resources. There's just less money and everything else, which is ironic to me because all of us are paying to be there. But it worked well for me because I was a rule follower. Didn't work well for my sister, who was a rebel. What are you? Are you a rule follower in general? Are you a rebel? I think it's really interesting that I bring this up because I was such a rule follower growing up, which probably accounts for my very rebellious nature now. Even hosting an anti-podcast like this one that is all about, hey, we're not going to help you figure shit out. You got to figure it out yourself, but we're going to be along the journey together. And that, I think, is a reaction to just my intense rule following for so many years. Because if you get in line, you'll be fine. That's almost the key word of growing up in an environment like that. Get in line and you'll be fine. Stay in line and you'll be fine. Something of that nature. So, for you, what was your experience? Are you still there? Are you still we have to follow these rules. We have to go according to these guidelines. We have to do this, religious or otherwise. I don't think one is right or wrong, but where I question it is, what is the purpose? I know even when I was a kid, winning those Bible, competitions, for me, it was all about the knowledge. It was all about the prestige. It was all about getting it done. It was all about winning, which, I don't know, should religion be all about winning? I think the stories I've heard about with religion being all about winning have never really ended well. They usually end up with some sort of war or something. What about you? I mean, have you heard of any positive ones that are all about winning? I don't know. All right, before we move on here, I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about when I get a little older and those rules turn into something different when you're in middle school and high school. Have you experienced that? So we'll be back with that in a moment after the break. This episode of the Derelict Podcast is brought to you by this unknown author who stated, "Hell will be filled with virgins and heaven with prostitutes." Thank you, unknown saint. Now back to the show. Okay, and we are back. So before the break, we were talking a little bit about just kind of how elementary school ruled. We talked about how evangelism was key, and we also talked about how experience was key. Let's move on. So then middle school and high school switched to a different church, non-denominational Christian church still, where most of my life was spent. And in this church, what I found to be true was that rules, and image were key. So go according to these rules. Think about this in any religious context. So again, I'm sure many of you can relate to this. Follow these rules and have this image, and you're golden. Sound like any religion you know? Sound like a religion maybe you grew up in? I sure can think of one, or two, or three, or several, or maybe all of them. Now, with this church, again, it was a great church. I loved youth group. I loved going to summer camps. Again, I was a middle schooler when we first started going there, maybe late elementary school, but middle school, I really got into it. I had really great mentors and friends. I was baptized. The culture was the purity ring culture. I might put a link to the South Park Jonas Brothers again. I've put it on past episodes as well. But if you've ever seen that one, it's all about the purity ring and the Jonas Brothers trying to sell sex to little kids, even though they're wearing purity rings. It's fantastic. It is probably my favorite South Park episode ever because of the fact that it was my life growing up. Now, what I think was really interesting about this church is because it was about rules and image, the guy who started it, it was like a lot of churches back in the day where it started in a basement or somebody's home and then got bigger and then eventually rented a building, then eventually bought a building and yada, yada, yada. That's how it seems like, at least from my experience, most churches start. The guy who started it eventually got kicked out of it. And the public view of that was really basically it's time for a transition. He's going to retire. We need to bring in some new leadership. Church is transforming, changing, etc. So it was done in a very, let's say, political sort of way. But frankly, my guess, just being a part of it or being in it when that was happening, was that he just wasn't magnetic enough. He was a guy who could get up there, he could give a really good speech, sermon, whatever you want to call it, go through certain points. He would have been a good public speaker, etc. But he just wasn't very magnetic. He wasn't one of those guys where he got up in the front and you're like, yeah, I'm going to do whatever that guy says he's going to do. And when your whole church is based on image, you need that. You need it. So he gets kicked out. Guess who gets brought in? One of the people from the staff that's much more magnetic. He has a bigger smile. He's more boisterous. His wife is more boisterous. They're more friendly. They go and talk to people. The first guy was an introvert. This guy's definitely an extrovert. And, frankly, church still exists. They grew crazy, bought new buildings. Maybe they're struggling now. I don't know. But it meant a lot to me. But why do I bring that up? Again, this is more of a talking about my story podcast, but what I also want it to convey is a thought from you. Are you or have you been a part of a religious tradition that is about either rules or image, or maybe both? And my question would be, from my perception, whenever I have failed because I've brought rules and image together, what that's done for me is it's made me only follow the rules because of the image I was portraying. Do you relate to that at all? Again, maybe this is just me. Maybe none of you have ever done this. But do you relate to, well, as long as I follow these rules, then God will love me. As long as I follow these rules, then other people will see that I'm a good, church member or a good religious person or whatever it is, whatever you want them to see. It was all around this church. It was in the suburbs, had big, beautiful buildings, had lovely Christmas displays, Easter displays, lots of creativity. I would say suburban creativity, if that makes sense for you. Think about what a suburban creative church might do at Christmas time versus like an urban church. You could kind of see the difference maybe in your head. But there was a lot of creativity. They had a whole drama department, huge band, everything else. And for me, growing up, it was a lot about the rules and the image, and people came because of that. But if you come to something because of rules and image, what do you leave with? So again, this episode is not about blaming a bunch of churches that I experienced growing up. It's more about me questioning, well, where do I do that in my own life? I have so many rules and filters and image perceptions that I try to maintain. Part of me, when I was writing what I was going to say today, I didn't want to videotape it today. And here we are on video. Why didn't I want to videotape it? The image thing popped up. I was like, I don't really want to get all beautiful looking and do all my stuff and try to figure everything out. I just kind of want to share what's on my mind. And here we are. And I'm sharing what's on my mind. And as you can see, I'm not dressed up or anything else. And I'm okay with that because that's the whole point of this podcast, is to be vulnerable and to try to figure out, where do I do that? Where am I so focused on rules and image that I miss the point? So then get a little older. I get into high school. I have a conversion experience just like my parents did. And here's what I've noticed about conversion experiences. Tell me if you relate to this at all. Have you or anyone you know had either a religious conversion experience or another conversion experience? It doesn't have to be religious, where all of a sudden the things that you were doing are unacceptable now? So here I am, a junior in high school. So I'm 16, 17 years old. And I swear off girls, I'm not going to date anybody. I got to focus on God. I got to focus on Jesus. Go on all these mission trips, become a part of this group called Knights of Christ, which is only a few select boys get invited in. We have to go through all these rules and regulations and live our lives according to these tenets, etc. I start interning at the church, helping out with the middle schoolers. And that was one of the first times I found out that even though I'm following all these rules and regulations and it's all about image, I still was myself. And you might not hear it. You hear it in spurts, I would say, on this podcast, but I can be kind of a crazy out of the box type of person. Sometimes I'm not. This episode's a good example of me not being it, but at least I think so. But I can be a little crazy. I loved working with middle schoolers because I loved their energy. I loved how crazy they were. I loved the fact that image mattered less to them. High schoolers were harder for me to work with, to be honest, because they were so stuck on themselves at all times. Today, I can't even imagine working with high schoolers. Goodness fucking sake, with TikTok and everything else, just I can't even imagine. But middle schoolers have always been some of my favorite kids. And most people don't want to work with middle schoolers. And I never understood why. And I think it's because I had such expectations, rules, etc., set upon me, and I bought into them and I believed them, that it was really fun to get outside of that. So here's my question to you as we're talking about this. Are there some rules and image that maybe you need to let go of today? Think about that. Take some time, whether you can do it now or later on, and write it down. Write down rules that you live by. Write down things that are important to your image, and see how many of them are impacting your life for the better. And then see if any you think might need to change to live a better, more fulfilled life. I'm curious. If you do that exercise, and you're so brave, would you send it to us? I'd love to read it, or at least part of it, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. I'd love to see what that looks like, because this is a constant kind of struggle being in the midst of it for me. All right, so we move on. Let's talk about the end of high school here. My beginning of my senior year of high school, 9/11 happened. And unless you were born yesterday, you know what that is, or you read about it in the history books if you're really young. And I can't think of a better example of failed religion than 9/11. The people that decided to bomb the planes and the towers and everything else, from what I can tell or what I've heard, it seems like was a lot of because of religious reasons. Now, again, this is not going to be a political statement. This is not going to be anti any sort of religious statement whatsoever. None of that. Because before we do that, we have to look deep inside of ourselves and say, where is my religion, whatever that is? Even if you're an atheist, you have religion. Where is my religion failing me or failing other people? As I record this podcast, there are plenty of religious battles, wars happening around the globe. My religion's right, your religion's wrong. Our religions are close, but here's the reason why mine's great and yours isn't. All over the place. And just like in my church growing up, even though we weren't a part of a religious war, when rules and image are your God, even more than God, that can cause some fucking problems. I know it has for me. When has it for you? When have rules and image become your higher power, your God, and you failed, like me, to see the deeper meaning, purpose, intention of life? I've done that plenty of times. plenty of times. And, I thought of one story that I think at least resonated with me well when it comes to this. Again, still went to a Christian religious school at this point. And as seniors, there was a new Jamba Juice that was opening up around the corner. And we all skipped class to go get a free Jamba Juice. We were gone for a while. 90%, let's say, of the seniors went, I think, something like that. When we came back, the principal called me into his office and held me responsible for everything. And I said, why? I mean, I'm not the only one that went. He said, well, you're the leader, and you led it, and you brought everyone. And then he went on this long spiel about how it wasn't very biblical, and I wasn't leading well, and this wasn't going to work well later on in my life, etc. And this is not a comparison or competitive because, there were other people shooting up schools at the same time this was happening. So clearly this was not as bad as that. However, what I think it points out, or at least pointed out to me at the time and still does to this day, when rules and image are God, if you don't follow the rules and you don't have the image, where's God? Think about that for a second. If rules and image are God, if you're not following the rules and you don't have the image, where's God? And God can't be dead. Therefore, we got to follow the rules and have the image. Wow. Interesting. I think the only other thing I want to mention at this point, and we may come back to this sometime, is that I then get into senior year. I date this girl all year long. She wanted to keep dating, going to college. I was leaving town. She wanted to get married. Sometimes I wonder what that would have been like. And I think the only thing that I want to mention compared to that, as well as these different elements of religion that I experienced growing up, is that anytime I think about what could have been different, like what if I didn't convert, or what if we went to a different church, or what if I grew up in an atheist household, or whatever, fill in the blank, I think about regrets. And we're going to talk about regrets later on in the podcast, not this episode, but in a later one. And what I've found to be true about regrets is that none of them are helpful. So I just decided a few years ago to never have them again. I've decided I'm just not going to regret anything in my life ever again. Now, could I have guilt over something that I did wrong? 100%. Could I be ashamed of something that I did? Yeah, I might have to work through that. But looking back and saying, wow, I really wish I would have done this differently. I really regret the way that I did it. I think is it's unfair to what life is trying to teach you. And I struggled with that when I was thinking about my relationship with church and religion growing up, because I thought, well, what if I would have had a healthier version of this? Then I wouldn't have had to regret all the difficulty and the hard stuff that I went through going through church. Well, guess what? That's not helpful. There's also nothing I can do about it. Absolutely nothing. So why regret it at this point? So there is something that changes when you go from high school to college, or your adult, that term's used very loosely, years, and trying to figure out what changes about the religion of my youth and how much of the religion of my youth am I going to keep. And the thing about being a young adult, as any of you have experienced that are older than a young adult, is that it's a very confusing time trying to figure that out. And did I fail at that transition? No, I don't think I failed at it. However, it was an interesting transition. So I'm going to save that for our next episode, give you a little carrot to think about. So thanks for being on this journey with me. Thanks for hearing a little bit more about my story. If you want to hear more about my story, guess what? My book is coming out later this year, and you can read a little bit more about it. It is all about being a derelict. So welcome. Again, thank you for listening to how I failed at religion as a kid. And more importantly, not only just how I failed at religion as a kid, but also a different way for me to think about the experiences that I had, the different churches, the different, what they found to be important, and then how that still affects my daily life. Like, to me, it's still amazing that I could grow up with so much structure, format, and everything else as a kid, and how it greatly impacted me, and how a lot of it I thought was, some of it had negative, some of it had positive impacts. And even the stuff that I felt was negative that I don't want to pass on to my kids, sometimes I still feel guilt and shame not passing on to my kids. Isn't that bizarre? How many times in your life did something happen to you growing up, and then when you're passing it on to somebody else, a younger person, mentee, child, your own kid, etc., your default is to pass on the same thing you learned, even when you don't believe it to be the best thing for that person. Have you ever experienced that? Again, maybe it's only me, but I've experienced it, and it's a wild ride, man. I don't really get it. So, thank you for listening about the different elements today of religion and how I failed as a kid. I hope you like what you heard. I hope you could relate. And I really hope that you send me a message. Please, again, if you haven't sent me a message, send me a message. And could you do me a personal favor? If you liked the episode, would you rate it? Would you subscribe? Would you become a part of this community? We're looking for derelicts. We're looking for people to be open and vulnerable and honest about their struggles. We're looking for guests. We always love hearing from other people and their story. And also, would you do me another favor? Would you send this to somebody? If this resonated with you, if you know somebody that grew up in a religious household, had difficulty as a kid, etc., send it to them. Maybe it's something that they just need to process themselves, or maybe they've been avoiding processing it. I didn't process a lot of these things till I went through therapy for years, frankly, and I'm still processing some of it. I still got nervous writing this today, so I know I'm not the only one. And again, I wouldn't be here without you. Thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you so much for being a loyal listener. Please subscribe, rate, review the podcast. Check the notes for the resources we talked about. Send us a message. Until next time, see you later, you derelict.